All right, so group and composite methods are really the same application, just to different types of groups. So it's a very simplifying procedure to record depreciation expense for companies. It maintains maintaining individual depreciation schedules for every type of asset you have could be problematic. And so this is a way to sort of streamline the process for a company. Group methods are going to combine related fixed assets into a group. So perhaps, as I have in the example down here, you have different types of buildings. You have manufacturing facilities, storage buildings, warehouses. This would be a group method. Composite methods don't even care, right? They'll put buildings with equipment, with fixtures and furniture, right? Dissimilar assets into groups for collective depreciation. Because the individual records are no longer kept, if the groups are disposed, if assets from this group depreciation are disposed, we don't have an individual accumulated depreciation amount, so we don't know a book value. Therefore, when we sell it, we can't take the sell price less the book value to determine a gain or loss, so we just assume there is no gain or loss computed on the sale. That means that accumulated depreciation is a plug value so that gain or loss equals 0, which just means that whatever the amount of cash you get for the asset is, you know what it cost, and you're going to plug accumulated depreciation so there's no room for a gain or a loss. So consider this schedule here. We have different types of buildings that will last us for different, cost different amounts, salvage for different amounts, have different service life. So, all I did here was look at their costs, their salvage, determine an allocation base for each. Then I have a number of service years. I divide that into each allocation base to determine the depreciation per year. Right. So here we have total depreciation per year for each type. We add those up. This gives me total depreciation for the group per year. This is the amount that I would recognize per year. So then that gives me, so then I can compute what we call a group depreciation rate, which is just looking at what the cost of these guys are collectively, dividing that into the depreciation per year. So 1,425,000, the depreciation per year, divided by 49 million gives me a 2.9%. I apply the depreciation rate to the cost to give me depreciation expense every year. I determine an average service life from the group by dividing the total depreciation per year into the allocation base. So I'm recognizing 1,425,000 per year, divide that into the group's allocation base to determine how many years I'm going to apply this for. So I would recognize depreciation on this group for 21.8 years. And again, it comes out to a sort of weighted average at this point. Actually, I have to think about that. I'm not sure if it's yeah, it is. It is weighted because depending on how much you spread the depreciation over time, that will impact, how much is per year, which impacts this number, which impacts which is divided into the allocation base. Anyway, so you're going to apply 1,425,000 per year for 21 years, and then for the last year, you would just take 0.8 times 1,425,000 in order to have it work. And again, and once these rates are locked, additions to the asset groups are added into cost, but typically and interestingly, we do not update the depreciation rates or the service life of our overall group. we might do it on a yearly basis, but we're not going to do it on a consistent basis where it's changing mid-year because we added another facility. We'll calculate the same depreciation that we would have, just apply it to the new cost. So for example, if we add a building for $1 million, then this would come up to 50 million. We take 50 million times 2.9%. Nothing else would change. Right away, at the end of the year, we would update the depreciation rate, which would update the service life. But again, we wouldn't do it every time we added a new building or every time we added a piece of equipment. We would just add it to the cost until the end of the year. The depletion is, again, just the cost allocation for natural resources. Nothing crazy going on here. Typically, units of production makes the most sense, but we don't have to follow units of production. Units of production makes the most sense because we're consuming gallons of substance from a well or taking out pounds or kilograms of mineral or precious metals from a mine, etc. We want to divide the amount of the resources to be extracted in total into the allocation base of the asset. So, we have the allocation base with the natural resource, just like any other fixed asset, where we have its acquisition price, including any ARO, divided by the total units we think we're going to get from it, gives me a depletion per unit. Then we just apply depletion expense. Amortization, cost allocation for intangible assets. There are two ways of doing this, and we're going to talk about just for we're going to focus right now on the definite life intangible assets. There are indefinite life intangibles, and they are not subject to amortization. Indefinite life intangibles have no bound on the useful or legal life. Goodwill, trademarks. Trademarks do have a legal life, but renewal is so easy, such that we consider indefinite. Goodwill certainly has no legal life because it's such an ambiguous concept to begin with. And certain franchise contracts, those contracts for which the renewal is nearly guaranteed for life, that you can continue to use the trademark, would be considered something that and also, like, for example, using branding on your own apparel. So, when Under Armour releases a new line of shirts that use the logo of the NBA or something like that, then that would be a franchise contract that may be considered indefinite. Anyway, so definitely these two are the more common ones, though, goodwill and trademarks. We do not apply amortization. We apply what we call impairment, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Finite life intangibles are amortized over their useful or legal lives, whichever is shorter, right? We want the shorter because that induces more expense, which brings down net income, which is in line with conservatism. Straight line depreciation is most commonly used for intangibles, but again, you could use a double declining rate or anything like that. In terms of legal lives, patents have a 20-year legal life, and copyrights are the life of the artist plus 70 years, I believe. So those are the legal lives. That's a copyright. Those are the legal lives. But again, remember, the useful life will probably be a lot shorter in terms of how we want to recognize the revenues over time, or recognize expenses over time. And again, no accumulated asset account really for these. Amortization expense, credit the intangible asset directly. Partial periods of depreciation occur when we buy the asset in the middle of the year, and we want to show that, for example, if we have an asset that's acquired on April 1st, we are just going to record 3/4 of the full period expense during the year and a quarter of it in the following year, right? Because April would be 3 months in, we only have 9 months left. We would determine how much depreciation we want to charge per year, multiply it by 3/4, right? The approach is really straightforward. As long as we're talking about straight line, no one has an issue with it, because the adjustment process becomes rather straightforward. When we do another method, it looks a little different. We're still applying the same idea, but the difference is that, when we determine, oh, wait, with straight line, it's $70,000 per year. So if I purchase it in April, then I want to do 3/4 of $70,000 in the first year, the first fiscal year, and then I can apportion the other quarter, which would happen in the second fiscal year, from January to April. And then again, 70,000, that was the second useful year, from April to December. But things become a little more complicated when we do something that has a different depreciation expense each year. And I'll show you how down here. So look at this. This is assuming that we purchased an asset on October 1st, and the firm's fiscal year end is 12/31. So I'm going to be referring to a fiscal year versus a useful year. The useful year means that, for example, October 1st to October 1st is the useful year, right? That's where the depreciation expense for that year is apportioned over. The fiscal year doesn't match to that useful year because the fiscal year is at December 31st. So looking at the straight line method, this is how it could be broken up. If I purchased it in October, November, December, there's 3 months remaining, so that's a quarter that you would want to recognize. Well, I recognize a quarter of the first useful year's depreciation in the first fiscal year. Right? The fiscal year ends on 12/31. I only have a quarter of it, 17,500. That makes sense. I wouldn't even have to use this jargon of useful and fiscal years. Well, then I apportion the remaining amount of the useful year in the second fiscal year. So 3/4 of that first useful year are going to be expensed then. And then a quarter of the second useful year's expense in the second useful year. That's October 1st, right? Because now we have the second useful year of the machine is beginning in October 1st of the second year, times a quarter is 17,500. Who cares? Because I'm apportioning 3/4 of 70,000, a quarter of 70,000 to get 70,000. And this just continues. So nothing changes. Again, straight line, pretty straightforward. The sum of the year's digits is going to be a little different. Why? Because in each useful year, the depreciation changes. So let's look at the first useful and fiscal. Useful year, the first one is 116,667, right? That's the depreciation expense I calculated. I want to recognize a quarter of it in the first fiscal year. Now when I get into the second fiscal year, I still have 3/4 of that first useful year depreciation expense remaining. I only charged a quarter of it here. So 3/4 of 116,667 gives me 87,500. But now I'm done with the first useful year because it's October 1st in the second fiscal year. So now I go to my second useful year's depreciation expense and apply it at a quarter, which gives me 23,333. I add those up. This is depreciation expense for the second year, the second fiscal year. But I haven't used all of the estimate from the second useful year, so I begin the third fiscal year by apportioning the remaining 3/4 of it, and then it's October 1st of the third fiscal year, which begins the third useful year. So I have to now start applying 70,000. 70,000 will be applied for a quarter. I add it up to get the total depreciation expense for the third fiscal year. So you can see this partial issue becomes a little bit more complex when you're dealing with a non-consistent, constant expense over time. So companies will typically make a simplifying assumption, right? Whenever something gets scary, especially for companies that involve themselves in millions of dollars of transactions and billions of dollars of assets, we can't be hung up on details like this, right? That's okay if you have, $1,000 of assets on your balance sheet. You can keep track of that kind of stuff. But when we're talking about multi-million, multi-billion dollar companies, we can no longer really afford that sort of exact precision. So we'll either use what we call the half-year convention or the modified half-year convention. So the half-year convention is pretty simple. It says that we don't care when we bought the asset. We're going to pretend like it's halfway through the year. Okay. Think of it this way. You're splitting the difference, right? You're always going to get an average. So if I bought it in January, nope, bought it on July 1st. If I bought it in October, nope, bought it in July 1st. If I bought it December 31st, nope, bought it on July 1st. So then we record half the depreciation expense in the year of the acquisition and disposition. Now notice, right, when I looked at the exact partial, when I bought it with only a quarter of the year remaining, I had a quarter of the year in the beginning year and 3/4 at the end of the year. So all the half-year assumption does is it takes a quarter from this year, subtracts it off, and then adds it up here, right? And so it just balances out what would have happened. No big deal. So, but the big deal, sorry, go back to this. The big deal is that rather than having to worry about this crap, if we applied the half year to the sum of the year's digits, I would have recognized 116,667 divided by 2 in the first fiscal year. And then I would only have 116,667 divided by 2 remaining in the second fiscal year. And then I would have begun with 93,333 divided by 2 as the remaining amount for the second fiscal year, all the way down to the point that I would only have 23,333 divided by 2 in the final fiscal year. Okay. So it simplifies it somewhat. But we can do better. Right? We can do a modified half-year convention, which means that any asset bought during the first half of the year is recorded at a full year of depreciation, doesn't matter. If it's bought in the second half of the year, then we act like we didn't buy it during this year. We bought it at the end of the year, right? Or at the beginning of the second year. So how would that have looked? For the October, there would be no depreciation expense in the first fiscal year. This is the modified half year. No depreciation expense in the first year. Then 116,667 would be my depreciation expense in the second year. 93,333 would be my depreciation in the third. And then I would recognize all 23,333 in the final year. Okay, so I'm going to try to make some timelines just to make it more generalized. So for the half-year convention, if we have, say, I'll make it pretty simple, 3 years, I bought it on October 1st, which means that if it's 3 years, it would go to 1, 2, 10-1 of the third year. This is its disposition. The half-year convention would say, no, we're not going to worry about that. We're going to apply depreciation as if it was bought on July, and we're going to shift it, right? So we're still recognizing 3 years of depreciation expense. So this is going to become the depreciation schedule, even though this is the reality. Okay, so just taking everything, shifting it over a little bit. That's the half year. The modified half year, and I'll do 2 because it kind of changes, right? Would be if it's bought on 10-1, and it has a 3-year life, we say, nope, I'm not going to worry about that partial crap. I'm going to move it so that the depreciation schedule starts at the end of the year and goes until the end of the year. So I'm still recognizing 3 years, 1, 2, 3. I'm just not recognizing it in reality to the actual day that we could dispose of it. And again, say if, well, I'm not going to have enough room to do 2. Say if it was in January or not, say if it was in April or, April, right? So it's a little bit back here. We would just shift everything this way so that the modified half year says if it's bought before the half year, then we pretend like we bought it at the beginning of the year. Modified half year is wonderful because it gets rid of all that worrisome work of tracking depreciation through partial years, especially when the depreciation expense is not constant over time. All right, so that is the first part of Chapter 11, and I will discuss any questions you have in class.